may have known this song. Page 2. Ya Rabba Salami Amter Alayna Salam Ya Rabba Salami Imla Kulubana Salam. Once more. Ya Rabba Salami Amter Alayna Salam Ya Rabba Salami Imla Kulubana Salam. Thank you. You may sing in the language that you are comfortable with, but I will challenge you, sing it in Arabic. Let us prepare our hearts and minds to pray and hear God's words.
If you could all stand, please, so we may begin. From the east to the west, from the north and to the south, all nations and peoples bless the Creator of creatures with a new blessing. For God made the light of the sunrise today over the world. O congregations of righteous, who glorify the Holy Trinity in the morning of light, praise Christ, the morning of peace, together with the Father and the Spirit, for he has made the light of his knowledge shine over us. In peace, let us remember and celebrate the blessed memory of all those who, throughout the centuries, struggled for peace and justice, offering as the best witness to the world their own lives. Peace be with you, prophets. Peace be with you, apostles. Peace be with you, martyrs, who loved the Lord of peace, and peace be with the Holy Church, in which dwell sons and daughters of peace. Scripture reading from Isaiah 54, verses 1 to 10. I will read them in Arabic. ترنمي أيتها العاقر التي لم تلد، أشيدي بالترنم أيتها التي لم تمخض، لأن بني المستوحشة أكثر من بني ذات البعل، قال الرب. أوسعي مكان خيمتك ولتبسط شقق مساكنك، لا تمسكي، أطيلي أطنابك وشددي أوتادك، لأنك تمتدين إلى اليمين وإلى اليسار، ويرث نسلك أمما ويعمر مدنا خربت. لا تخافي لأنك لا تحزنين، ولا تخجلي لأنك لا تستحين، فإنك تنسين خزي صباك، وعار ترملك لا تذكرينه بعد، لأن بعلك هو صانعك، رب الجنود اسمه، ووليك قدوس إسرائيل، إله كل الأرض يدعى. لأنه كامرأة مهجورة ومحزونة الروح دعاك الرب، وكزوجة الصبا إذا رذلت، قال إلهك. لحيظة تركتك، وبمراحم عظيمة سأجمعك، بفيضان الغضب حجبت وجهي عنك لحظة، وبإحزان أبدي أرحمك، قال وليك الرب. لأنه كمياه نوح هذه لي، كما حلفت أن لا تعبر بعد مياه نوح على الأرض، هكذا حلفت أن لا أغضب عليك ولا أزجرك. فإن الجبال تزول والأكمام تتزعزع، أما إحساني فلا يزول عنك، وعهد سلامي لا يتزعزع، قال راحمك الرب.
I will start with a greeting from our culture, our language, which means salam or salum or good morning, buenos dias. And you have to say it back to me, and you read it just as it is written. Horas. Horas. Yes, thank you very much. Sisters and brothers in Christ, I thank God for this wonderful opportunity share God's word and to be with us, because I feel honored to be here at the Central Committee meeting as being a substitute for my Archbishop, Reverend Willem Simarmata, and he could not be here, and he sends his greeting to us all. And speaking about honor, now our Bible text today begins with shame and ends with the promise of God's steadfast love, which resulted in bringing back honor. But let's face it, in our society, and most of collectivistic cultures, we are still very closely connected with the idea of honor and shame. Honor is something that we achieve in the community. One can feel honored when performing something that is acknowledged by the society or trusted to do something, like what I feel at this moment. But also, honor makes you try to do the best for that trust. However, one is obliged to maintain the honor, and if I did something wrong, then the shame will be on the whole church, not only me. So one dishonor action can have an effect to the whole community, actually. And that is the concept of shame and honor in more closely related societies. However, in defending one honor, someone can commit crime, which makes him guilty in the eye of the legal system. We can commit honor killing. In such society, we need to remember that shame, too, can be devastating for a person's identity and emotion. When someone, I used to say this because this is part of my larger research. If someone say to you, what do you feel more heavy in your heart? If someone say, shame on you, or if someone say, you're guilty? Which one rings the heaviest in your heart. In a more collectivistic culture, shame on you brings a lot of judgment. And one can be found guilty and yet feel honored when he's defending the group's honor. We can take an example of person killing the whole family, or person killing another person, or suicide bombing, or violence that is happening all around the world. Sometimes they relate that to honor defending. They are defending honor while at the same time committing a crime. On the other hand, an individual who did well in the eye of the legal system, or doing something that is really important and good for the society, can be shamed for doing the right thing. I have a friend who is working very closely in the communication of peacemaking, peace building project in Jerusalem, and she was shamed by the society because he was defending the other side. So that's also an example how we think of honor and shame. Now, of course, wars, conflicts in Asia, Middle East, and this is probably not the right really map, because if we think about it, the conflicts that are happening are sometimes more complicated than just territorial dispute or money or even religious matter. Sometimes they are intensified by the honor-shame factor, precisely because our societies are based on that aspect. So you see, it's really difficult to solve conflict and to achieve forgiveness in honor-shame-based society. People can attack others not necessarily because out of vengeance, but out of bringing back honor. And because you have to bring back your honor, you attack other people. So that's mainly the thing. The memory of what has happened some 100 years ago can bring back the emotion. And that is why honor and shame factor must be discussed and put on the table on such peace initiative. And honor and shame is about relation. Many theologians have tried to understand this, from Augustine, Luther, Barth, Schmemann, my favorite, Johann Baptist Metz, etc. Your wrong action can exclude you from the community. So shame is about excluding others. And ultimately, excluding you from your relation to God. And that is why the heaviest penalty for the crime is not precisely capital punishment, but it is the exclusion from the community. Because when you're excluded, you're extinct. You are being put to exile, cut off from any relation from anyone else. Your face will not be able to meet other people's face. You will have an alone face. What honor is it that you have if you're in such situation? And it is why the book of Isaiah speaks about bringing back the honor by God's compassion towards Israel, exile. And that honor comes in the form of the return of God's face. God will not hide God's face anymore to the people. The return of God's face toward the people starts the pilgrimage of Israel returning to the land. And as God's people, Israel views shame as a result of God's rejection and punishment. Jerusalem was often warned by the prophets on their failure to be loyal to God, which resulted in public humiliation, which in turn is God's punishment. So shame more often connected with God's punishment. And God's punishment, the ultimate one, is being cut off from the community. Now, in Isaiah 30, for instance, that describes the shame and disgrace that come through a people that cannot profit them, that brings neither help nor profit. In that shame comes rejection and exclusion. Now think about people that are being excluded from the community precisely because of their action. And In Isaiah 54, verse 8, God says, in overflowing wrath for a moment I hid my face from you. So what's interesting in Isaiah 54, there are two types of shame. The first one, from verse 1 till 4, is about the story about how Sarah was ashamed because she was not able to bring a child. But then that shame was in God's plan. And God's plan is to bring honor to her by making her descendants as a great nation. So that is not because of Sarah's fault, but that is within God's plan. That is first type of shame. The second type is Israel's mistake, and that is why God banished them and sent them to exile. And this one is more because of Israel's fault. And in the Bible, we've seen here and there that God's honor is not the same with the honor that we receive in the society. Sometimes, or most of the times, to receive God's honor, we are required to do the acts that society deemed as shameful. In the New Testament, Jesus introduces a new set of honor value against the commonly accepted norm, such as the least among you all will be the greatest. Or that he washes the feet of the disciples. And the event of the crucifixion is also setting up a new standard of honor. The Jews in that time understood that honor can be shown by God's blessing and accompaniment. Meanwhile, Jesus' public humiliation on the cross and death means that he should be ashamed. But his resurrection was the clearest example that God is with him, which made a new standard of shame and honor. Now shame is not doing God's work, and honor is doing what God commands us to do. And brothers and sisters, in the New Testament also, Paul changes the honor standard of this society for Christian communities. In Roman or Greco culture, honor is something that you can gain from competition in all levels. So you will be ashamed when you lost. You will be ashamed when you are poor. You will be ashamed when you are outcast. But Paul said, the ultimate glory, the ultimate honor is the one who is doing the glory of God. Now, in that case, no one can boast for honor because everything is God's grace. And in other hand, Paul connects shame with sin and unfaithfulness to God, and human disobedience to God is sinful and thus shameful. And for early Christian communities, honor is something that they have to gain from new family of Christian community. They are willing to do different things from what the world is doing, precisely because they know their honor only comes from God and not from our society. Now, that's why we need to see spiritual shame and social shame. Spiritual shame is when we are standing in front of the divine humanity. We will feel as if we are standing in front of a mirror looking back at our humanity, at the things that we could have and should have done, but did not. And I hear that a lot in our meetings, especially from the moderator's address. We should be ashamed for the things that we did not do. But social shame, it comes from other expectation, from other people, about who we are and how we should act. And unhealthy shame always makes demands, and the society will decide if one is good enough for them. And that's why if the society thinks what you're doing is normal, you will not feel ashamed, even though you're guilty. I can give you an example. In Indonesia, corruption is really quite high. But since everybody is doing it, when they got arrested nowadays, they still smile to the camera and wave. Because they now wear bright orange vest as a sign that they are a prisoner from a corruption case. But every time when they are presented to the public, they will They will wave and smile and say, this is a test of God. Because everybody is doing it. It's just normal. So you don't feel ashamed anymore, even though you are guilty. So your standard is the people's standard and not God. And in Isaiah 54, verse 14, and this is the last one because I will try to have a discussion here among us. It says here, in righteousness you shall be established, you shall be far from oppression, for you shall not fear from terror, for it shall not come near you. So God's honor is a pilgrimage of honor. Coming back from our exile, and think about this. I want us to, because I really like our discussion, even though I know it takes a long time to just to get around, and to stop the discussion also takes a long time. But I would like us to sit in small groups and discuss this following question. The first one is, what are the honor shame factors that play a role in the story of conflict in your context? And are they being addressed or over-addressed? And the second question is that, how would you see the pilgrimage of justice and peace can bring honor, can bring face, can bring voice back to the excluded? Please discuss this in your group. 10 minutes. sisters and brothers, it's an honor that the bus group is going, and I hope you can, it's going to continue in further discussions in the next sessions. But we will continue our morning prayer and Bible study, and we will close this morning prayer. Let us pray, saying together, O Christ, our God, author of life and giver of peace, guide us so that we may walk in your ways of righteousness, and we may arrive at the heaven of life and salvation in peace, through your mercy. For you are our helper and our deliverer, and to you is fitting glory, dominion, and honor, now and forever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. And may the peace of God be with us today. Let us share God's peace with each other. Amen.
So then we are ready for our second part. Good morning. And our second part this morning is a session on Middle East. And as you know, this is an issue that has involved the World Council of Churches for years, because it is a necessity. It is about our Christian brethren and their future. It is about religious coexistence. It is about justice and peace. And therefore, one session is spent on this. It is a crammed session. We will, first of all, listen to a specialist. We will then open up for questions and answers for a short period of time. Then we'll have a panel, and at the end we will have some reflections from 3 listeners. They are just people who have been asked to listen very carefully during this whole session. Of course, you are all doing that, but we picked out 3 just to give us a reflection afterwards. And all this we're supposed to do before coffee. I first want to welcome our keynote speaker. It is His Eminence Dr. Tarek Mitri, who is the director of the Islam Affairs Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut. And he's a former UN General Secretary Special Representative. He's also been head of United Nations Support Mission in Libya and a former minister in different Lebanese governments. Middle East, so much, and the cradle of the civilization that we are living in. We are interdependent, and we need to know more. Please, Dr. Mitri.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. 5 years ago, Arab uprisings initiated in an unanticipated manner transformations in a region that seemed resistant to change. For some time, expectations and hopes energized a large number of people, whether young or not so young. Today's disillusionment, though understandable, is often rushed and at times engineered. It serves the purposes of justifying attempts to reverse transition, divert its course, and withdraw into defensive and aggressive identity politics. Disillusionment, uncertainty, and fear notwithstanding, the yearning for dignity, freedom, political participation, which motivated revolutions against authoritarian regimes, could not be dismissed as ephemeral. The broad-based social demand for democracy, no matter how vaguely conceived, is often ignored by those who precipitously opt for an essentialist and culturalist explanation of the difficulty or even the impossibility of an Arab transitioning towards a democratic polity and society. Precarious national structures and the related fragility of national cohesion and identity, exacerbated further by the rapid collapse of the old order, favor the tendency to overemphasize the strength of primordial ties in comparison with the civic ties that constitute modern democratic societies. One could not ignore the resurgence or even the reinvention of sub-national identities and the centrifugal forces at work in many Arab countries. Many members of communities, not only minorities, seem to have lost their aspiration to a state for all. They beg for a power structure that can protect them from another community. Weakened states and political and electoral strategies of mobilization accentuated communalism and encouraged the surfacing of narratives of victimhood, often emotional and at times aggressive. Ethnic groups and religious groups are both actors and victims of identity politics. Throughout the 20th century, their members struggled to assert themselves and be recognized as citizens. But many retreated into minority-centered communities. Expression of identity politics are intertwined with post-uprising conflicts. Many leaders across the region do little more than tap into the use of persecution felt by communities without offering them alternatives to fear. Many are victims, but ethnic and religious minorities, Christian included, claim extraordinary victimhood. No matter if some of them, such as the Yazidis of Iraq, have suffered far more than others. The very conflict that undermine what is left of the state for many rulers of the region is a source of legitimacy, a cause for further entrenching and a distraction from addressing problems that they are not capable or unwilling to resolve, such as in Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Yemen. It is not, therefore, a surprise to see violence becoming a policy by default. Some would argue that the USA political decision to retreat from the Arab world meant, in actual fact, endorsing the very forces fueling the Arab nations and states' self-destruction. One could not ignore the extent to which the USA, despite its tendency to disengage, remains at the heart of Arab politics. Friends and foes alike continue to construct their narratives and define their courses of action on the basis of what they guess to be Washington's intentions. A striking example is the Syrian regime. Pretending to confront the USA, it keeps an eye on its response as it crossed every possible red line. Russia could not have launched its war on Syrian soil and led the hesitant political process were it not convinced that the Syrian opponents of the regime, unlike the Afghans of the 1980s, had no real support from the American rival. More importantly, the withdrawal of America sucked the Russians into the void, exacerbating the deadly tensions. In Europe, hesitant and incoherent attempts at pursuing democratization, sanctioning human rights abuse, engaging moderate Islamists, developing humanitarian responses, resorting to diplomacy, and articulating a refugee policy are being overshadowed by, or even subdued by, one idea, almost obsessive: accepting any power structure or initiative that might protect Europe against Daesh, the self-styled Islamic State, and protecting Europe against the spillover of massive refugee movement. Looking back at the internal transformations in the Arab world, one has enough reasons to fear that many countries will continue their descent into disintegration, violence, and chaos. However, there are changes at work that could, and I'm not making a prediction here, open the way for regeneration. The state system has fallen in Iraq. In Lebanon, state institutions have become largely dysfunctional. In Palestine, with an ever-increasing Israeli intransigence, with the continuing colonization of the West Bank, and the absence of an effective policy of the US, self-described as an honest broker, the two-state solution is increasingly becoming more elusive. There is no peace process worthy of the name. It had become only a vacuous process. Libya has not succeeded so far in re-emerging from its multiple civil wars. Tunisia, for its part, is often regarded as a relative success in the post-uprising region. It has followed the path of peaceful political transformations, bridging the gap between Islamists and secularists. A compromise transcending political and ideological divides produced a progressive constitution. Egypt is still a prey to polarization between army and Islamists, depicted indiscriminately as terrorists, with a bloody confrontation triggered by the reversal of the political process that was augured by the 2011 uprising. In Syria, where a peaceful and rather secular uprising was militarized by necessity once the civilian population was repeatedly targeted by bloody repression. Calls for decisive protection of civilians in Syria remained unanswered. The international community had no appetite for action in Syria. The Western military intervention in Libya, initially meant to protect the civilian population in Benghazi, and at the same time, of course, serve national interests of some European countries such as France, failed in stabilizing Libya and in facilitating its transition to democracy. The failure in Libya was invoked as an argument for the justification of passivity in Syria. The regime's survival, largely attributed to Iranian and more significantly in recent times to Russian support, reveals an asymmetry that determines the course of a conflict which, more than anywhere else in the region, has extended beyond national borders. The massive influx of refugees into neighboring countries, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and its spillover into Europe, as well as the control of Daesh, ISIS, over swaths of territory, are two illustrations of the regionalization and internationalization of the Syrian internal conflict. In conclusion, transition from authoritarian regimes to democracy has proved to be more arduous than anticipated, the Tunisian exception notwithstanding. Today, the social demand for security and stability in the context of a bloody disorder is interpreted, in the case of Egypt, for example, as a demand for return to an authoritarian rule. But it is not. Repression is far less tolerated today than it was yesterday. The call for political participation could not be silenced. The legacy of authoritarian regimes weighs heavily on political conduct and the management of transition, and it nurtures suspicion and mutual fears. Rebuilding state institutions left in desolation is severely hindered. To be sure, the shortfalls of transitions could not be overstated. The deficit in competence and experience of large segments of the new political elites, the weakness of political forces with a social base attached to democratic values or aspiring to democratic orders, all of those explain the volatility of state building. Progress on this arduous road towards democratic transformation could not be achieved by adopting a presumably universal model of transition. A paradigm for political change has to be better suited for the realities of today, not the lingering hope of an earlier era. Precipitation in moving forward will not adequately recognize the strength of subnational identities, nor those of cultural resistance to new forms of political practice. Inclusivity is an energizing principle, but it is considered too costly for those who are in power. They refrain from reaching out to the fearful minorities, whether ethnic, religious, or political. Equally, their inability to include contributes to the radicalization of the excluded. Inability to include contributes to the radicalization of the excluded. I'm not going to state the obvious now, this is my concluding remark, about the plight of Christians and their sense of suffering, marginalization, and regrettably self-marginalization, but I'd rather offer a few conclusive remarks that are more in line with the analysis I proposed. In my view, Christians possess the intellectual tools and the moral motivation to discern and acknowledge the resistance of many of their Muslim compatriots to the hegemonic tendency of what is often called radical Islam. They have spiritual resources to resist the alarmism of fear. This is not an invitation to shy away from a serious recognition of threats and risks, nor is it an idealistic call to patience. It's rather an act of faithfulness to the values Christians have constantly upheld. Throughout their recent history, many Christians refrained from overplaying minority militancy and identity politics. The notion of Christian presence was their antidote to both aggressive communalism and withdrawal from public life. In the same vein, the role of church institutions was defined not only in terms of their function of preservation, but by the gospel-rooted imperative of witness and service to the neighbor. Churches never perceived Christians and Muslims as two monolithic blocks facing each other, nor did they oppose the rights of the minority to the aspirations of the majority. There is another way, in contrast with the path walked by those who opt for exclusively minority-centered militancy, or by those who choose the silence of fear, resignation, or emigration. It is opened by the reinvention through political participation of the pact of citizenship that binds Christians and Muslims together. True, the future of Christians in the Arab world does not depend only on them, but on their fellow Muslims and on the ability of all to rebuild states based on citizenship, the rule of law, while recognizing the wealth of religious and cultural plurality that would spare the Arab world the sad face of uniformity. My concluding statement is about being called and calling ourselves minorities. The notion is loaded with historical overtone. For some, it evokes conspiracies, manipulation by foreign powers, 19th century, and subversion of majority rule. For others, it's associated with religious and cultural rights and with the idea of protection by foreign powers. In modern times, Christians learn to affirm their self-understanding as citizens rather than as members of minorities. Voices that seem to be suppressed today will not be voices silenced forever. To be sure, we live in times of suffering, fear, and uncertainty, but there are also times of change. And Christians are not only victims, therefore, crying out their plight, they are also called to be faithful and hopeful actors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mitri, for this grim and realistic and still hopeful paper as I listen to it. You bring out, you say that Christians have the intellectual tools of discerning that there are also friends and that there is a possibility of regaining the idea of a common political citizenship. But of course these things are, in the light of the present locked situations in many of these countries, difficult to hope for. Well, these were just some very opening reflections. I now invite you to the microphones for questions and answers to this presentation. And we have some minutes for us there. And I see microphone number 4, that would be the first speaker. And we take a couple of questions before I leave the word to Dr. Mitri again.
Thank you very much. My name is Klaas van der Kamp from the Netherlands. I would like to ask you 2 questions. First, would you call it genocide, things which are happening in Iraq and Syria? And secondly, how do you look at Christian solidarity with concrete Christian groups in these countries? Is that a Christian duty, or might it be dangerous because you emphasize the minority status of the Christians over there? Thank you.
As I see no one else having approached the microphone, I leave the word to you, Dr. Mitri.
I think in my in my presentation, I alluded to the Yazidis as being victims of a genocide. As to the rest of communities that are suffering hardship and in some cases persecution, I would rather use the notions of crimes, war crimes and crimes against humanity. Probably Syria and Iraq are the two countries where there is a concentration of crimes against humanity and war crimes. And I'm one of those who hope that whatever the political solution in Syria might be, whatever the political solution in Iraq could be, there won't be impunity for war crimes and crimes against humanity. With respect to your second question, I think that there are a number of Christians, perhaps not in large quantities, who have opted for the civic relationship that binds them to Muslims as over the primordial ties of being members of in a minority, and therefore are active in civil society work. I'm amazed. Yesterday I was talking to a Syrian colleague about the work many Christians are doing with their Muslim neighbors and co-citizens in Syrian civil society. I come from Lebanon, where civil society, in spite of the dysfunctional political institutions, has emerged as a force to reckon with. And much of the bonds that bring those members of civil society together transcend the minority-majority divide. I argued in my short presentation that minority-majorities are not just a numerical notion. They have to do with attitude, with defining yourself in relation to your neighbors. If you're able to reconcile the rights of marginalized groups, be they minorities or oppressed groups, with the legitimate aspirations of majorities, and I think in the Arab world what is at stake is primarily the aspiration of the majorities that has been frustrated. If you're able to reconcile minority rights with majority aspirations, you're then in the struggle for a better future. And that is probably the reason why I'm not hopeless.
Thank you very much. Microphone number 2.
Father Husik Mardirosyan, Armenian Apostolic Church, Holy See of Cilicia from Lebanon. Moderator, Your Excellency, thank you for your very realistic presentation. I have a few points that I want to share. Middle East is clearly not the Middle East we were looking at 5 or 6 years ago. Yes, we were all excited with the democratization of the Middle East, yet it is also a fact that systems must be adopted into the society, and contextualization is a must in this instance. Thank you for your conclusion. It is true that Christians sometimes consider themselves minorities, sometimes are considered minorities. Yes, if we talk with numbers, we are minorities, but Christians give so much to the Middle Eastern society. And it is very important to remind people that we are not newcomers. Our roots are in the Middle East, and we are part of the fabric of the Middle Eastern society. And thus, this gives us the thought that we as Christians in the Middle East have to talk about our equal rights, equal obligations as co-citizens with other Muslims and brothers and sisters. Thank you.
Thank you. We have two speakers at microphone number 3, and if you limit yourself to maximum 2 minutes, we can take care of both of you.
I will try. Tarek, thank you so much. I find this always very helpful to listen to your analysis. My question is the future of these countries. What kind of political system are we aiming at? Sometimes we hear voices who say democracy in these countries is just a dream in some Western brains, and it's too far away from the people in these regions. When I listen to you, I have the impression that you would still suggest, speaking about minorities, the rights of minorities and so on, I have the impression that you would still hold to the idea that democracy is the way for Libya, for Syria, and so on. Is that correct? And how do you see this critique that this is just a Western idea? Thank you.
Thank you. And Kirsten?
Hello, my name is Kirsten Auken. I'm representing the Danish Lutheran Church, and I'm also working for an organization called Dan Mission, and we are quite actively working with religious groups in, for instance, your country in Lebanon. And what we're seeing is that some of the tensions from your societies are actually spilling over into several European countries. We see some of the polarization between Christians and Muslims, and new tensions coming up, and we see politicians grappling with how to deal with this, and also citizens. So I would actually ask your advice for our governments and the decision makers. How can we promote a sense of citizenship across religions and across different cultures in our countries, so that not only we should help you, but actually we need your advice to help us as well in our societies?
Thank you. You stayed under 1 minute. Thank you very much for these interventions. And now, please, Dr. Mitri.
Yeah, with respect to Fernando's comment, I tried to say that that there is no universal model for democratic transition, and cloning European democracy in the Arab world is an impossible task. But I still believe that the way for democratic participation is still open. Rather than a dream, I would call the quest for democracy an energizing principle. And I can argue about that when I talk about every country in the Arab world. Every country, the quest for democratic participation is still an energizing principle. Now it's still premature to close the chapter of democratic transformation in the Arab world. A joke, if I may, a French prime minister visited China at the time when Zhou Enlai was prime minister of China. And in the small talk that preceded the formal conversations, he asked him about France, because Zhou Enlai studied in France and knew French history pretty well. Asked him about his opinion about the French Revolution. And Zhou Enlai said, it's premature to make a final judgment. So 5 years is too short for me to make a final judgment on democratic transformation in the Arab world, if I may. With respect to the second question, I think, and I alluded to that in my presentation, Europe has been doing its best to deal with the symptoms of the crisis in the region, combating radicalization of young Muslims, combating terrorism, dealing volens nolens with the influx of refugees, legal, illegal, semi-legal, and dealing with the problems of refugees in your own countries. All of this is quite a burden, I admit. But the real issue is, as in the World Council you love to use the word, is dealing with the root causes of all of this. And this is where I see the striking absence of Europe. Take Syria, where the role of Europe has been marginal, at best, in seeking a political solution, in weighing heavily on the political process that might lead to a reasonable, acceptable, moral political solution for Syria. Now, who are we to advise you how to deal best? But I think your countries are countries based on the rule of law, and do no harm in applying the rule of law. that is my advice. Of course, churches have a pastoral responsibility to deal with refugees, and I think the kinds of tensions you were alluding to could and should be dealt with pastorally. But looked at from the standpoint of the state, all you need to do is to apply the law wherever the law is applicable. Thank you.
Well, as you have seen on your papers, we also have a second question and answering session coming after the panel. But we now move over to the panel, and would you move up and take your seats up here, those of you who are to be part in that. And Your Eminence, you are welcome to stay, or you're welcome to sit down.
Moderator, can I just a comment and not a question?
Pardon?
Just a comment and not a question.
Okay, you can do that while they enter up.
I'll be glad. About the issue of democracy and the dream of Europe. It is not so. It is the dream of the people of the region, and we do not like democracy to come over tanks or to be implemented by foreigners. We would like democracy to be born and birthed through the population themselves and not from outside.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm now surrounded by some new people. If you have looked into your paper, you see that the objectives that are spelled out for this morning session are actually 4. And the first one is to have an overall analysis of the situation by a specialist. And that's what we have had, and we have had interventions that have really given us also more perspectives to that. And then we also have these stories, church actions that have been important, other actions, other good signs, and also the call for churches and religious constituencies to be actors. And I think this is what our panel is going to aim more at. We have 3 participants in it. They are given some minutes each. And the first one I will give the word to is Mrs. Hind Kabawat, the Director of Conflict Resolution Program of Syria, Center for World Religions, Diplomacy and Conflict Resolution at the George Mason University, United States Institutes of Peace. So, please, Mrs. Kabawat.
This is too long here. Thank you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for inviting me. And the little minute, it's 9 minutes, so I'm going to be very effective of what I'm saying. So, as you know, the situation in Syria remains dire and worsening at an alarming rate. At least 500,000 have lost their lives. Nearly 14 million in need of humanitarian aid. 5 million refugees and over 6 million internally displaced people. The ceasefire that was reached in the beginning of the year is no longer respected. The absence of sanctions for violations and its limited geographic scope are seriously damaging its credibility. Sadly, we have seen thousands of innocent civilians killed and wounded by indiscriminate airstrikes airstrikes, and barrel bombs despite the so-called cessations of hostilities. Inside Syria, over 1 million live under medieval sieges, the overwhelmingly majority of which are imposed by the Assad regime. Areas such as Daraya received very limited aid recently, but are still yet to receive food aid since 2012. This is unacceptable. And hundreds of thousands of innocent Syrians remain unlawfully in detention, many under brutal conditions, including torture and starvation. This is why the Syrian people, representing the mosaic of Syria, of the Syrian society, are working together now with the international community, in particular our European friends, to set out a new comprehensive approach and bringing about a political solution for Syria. But despite this tragic situation looked from micro perspective, there are still signs of hope and excellent peace buildings initiatives going on the ground. Who was in peace building inside Syria, and many humanitarian initiatives initiated by Christians on the ground. There's Christians and non-Christian inside and outside Syria, under regime control as well as area under government control. I can spend days to tell you about those initiatives. But very short, there is lots of churches open their doors to be hospitals. Many priests on the ground and many Christians, they're working in educations, working in peace initiatives and mediations and others. My own school, it's a refugee, is a center, literacy center in South Turkey, run by a priest, Orthodox priest, and by myself, and founded by Christian, Jewish, and Muslim friends. And we're responsible for education for 70 Muslim girls. And this is, we're not doing it because we have to, because we're doing it because we want to. This is our duty, and this is our job. As we say, lots of education, lots of schools, small schools run by Christians. But now, what about the church? The church has a very important role to play in the peace building process for the Syrian people, and in particular Syrian Christians. But in fact, you all know the difficult situation in which the religious institutions in Syria find themselves. We can quickly describe the situation as follows. All institutions are obliged to accommodate themselves with the system and the regime. Some of them by conviction, many others because they are benefiting from the system. But when it comes to clergy, Muslim and Christians alike, a certain number is supporting a dictatorship in Damascus or a caliphate in Raqqa. In fact, there are two sides of the same coin, and they are harming the future peace of Syria. But there is also those among the clergy who are supporting the people of Syria and who are doing so many great humanitarian work on the ground. Peace building initiatives, we have facilitation and mediation work, but they are a silent majority and working discreetly and taking a life risk by staying in the regime control area and extremist one. God bless them. And there are all those who have left the country, Christian and Muslims, who were pushed to leave the country because of their activism, or they don't want to serve in the military service, or they don't want even to fight with the extremists. They just don't want to fight. They don't want the war. So they left the countries. The church is not requested to take sides. It's not. But even in this sensitive situation, but I should say, because of this situation, the church should find ways to say the truth, power, in wisdom, but without compromises. Unfortunately, this is not the case with our churches in Syria and in the whole region generally. The churches cannot speak about their own suffering without taking into consideration the suffering of the whole population in the Middle East. The church cannot condemn the extremist Islamic terrorism action while ignoring to mention the hundreds of thousands of victims that result from the bloody oppression of the dictatorship in the region in general and in Syria in particular. This is about what is right and what is wrong. This is about easing the human suffering. This is about making protection of the civilians paramount to ending the Syrian conflict. These are all the values Christianity had taught me and what I have taught my children and my students. The church, in a very sensitive and critical situation, but they are ethical and moral imperatives that have political implications which we cannot avoid address if we want to remain faithful to the Lord and to the gospel. I believe the church can support the Syrian people. Here I would like to mention the role of the World Council of Churches and thank the churches for the clear position and policy they have been developing around the Christian presence and witness in the Middle East and their several statements on Syria. I should also mention the unique role and initiative of the World Councils of Churches in bringing together Christian and Muslims from Syria to have an honest dialogue on the root cause of the war and to have together a common vision for the future of Syria based on shared values. So thank you. Among many actions the churches should do, we have to call to revival of the ceasefires in Syria in order to save lives of thousands of Syrians killed each month. This means ceasefire that is applied to all of Syria and enforced effectively to protect all Syrians of all backgrounds. This is our responsibility, protect the civilians. 2, call for an end to the medieval and lawful use of starvation as a weapon of war. Over 1 million Syrians continue to live in the daily torment of having no access to food or medication or medicine. It is important that we speak with one Christian voice, that these sieges must be broken by the international community. This is so unfair in the 21st century to see people are dying from hunger. This is so unfair. Even if they're Muslims, wherever, we cannot keep silence of this. Starvation is a weapon of war, and we don't want the history to be repeated. We need to call for the release of all political prisoners and of those who have forcibly disappeared and been tortured in prison. I want to mention here the lawyer, the Christian lawyer Khalil Ma'tou, my colleague, who is in the Syrian regime present, and the 2 bishops who are being disappeared. So we need to pray for their release. This urgent step will not only save lives and alleviate the human suffering, they will also create the much needed condition to get all sides back to the negotiation table and make real long-lasting political deal that is being demanded by the Syrians. As a Christians, with moral responsibility toward the world, we need to do what is right. And as Dr. Mitri, to use our intellectual tools and to stand firm for what is, to stand firm with all the oppressed people in the region and support life, dignity, and freedom. The people in the Middle East and Syria demand and they deserve to live in a better life. And we need your voice to protect them. Thank you.
And now I leave the podium to Dr. Mona Mushahwar, the co-moderator of the WCC Palestine Israel Ecumenical Forum that many of you know about. Please.
So good morning, everyone. And it is amazing as I'm listening to Hen speak, all that you said can be said of the situation, the siege on Gaza. It just, one oppression system is the same as the other. So it all applies. So, what I'm going to ask you to do is, as I'm speaking, please put yourselves in the shoes of Palestinians for just a few minutes and see if you can live with what I'm going to be telling you. In the past few days, as I looked from the many windows of this beautiful hotel and saw the beauty and the serenity of God's creation, the water, the sky, and the freedom, couldn't help but think, so this is what living in freedom must be like. I think of all the Palestinian children that are growing up, encaged by the wall that mentally and physically oppresses them, or under siege with no way out. Like the delicate new seedlings and flowers, they try to survive amidst the harsh realities of occupation, dehumanization, and humiliation and criminalization, but are too often plucked before they even bloom. This is the excruciatingly painful reality of Palestinian youth these days. In the next few minutes, I will try to give a Palestinian Christian witness to the situation on the ground from the past 2 years till today. You all know the history, so in the aftermath of the failure of 25 years of peace talks under the auspices of the US to achieve any real peace, we saw the inevitable down spiral into violence re-emerging. The Palestine Israel saga was entering a new era, one where Israel no longer cared about the international opinion, where the extremist right-wing fanatics were running the show in Israel, and the Palestinian Authority that's incapacitated by futile attempts to try to build an economy under occupation was becoming more and more powerless. In the beginning of the summer of 2014, a group of settlers kidnapped a 14-year-old Palestinian boy. His name was Muhammad Abu Khadir, from his neighborhood in East Jerusalem, very close to my neighborhood. He was tortured alive, made to swallow kerosene. He was drenched with it and then burned alive. The atrocity of the crime prompted a spontaneous uprising from Palestinian youth in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, and even among Palestinians living within Israel. Gaza itself, having been under siege for almost 10 years at the time, also retaliated by firing the primitive, unguided rockets into Israel. Now, in Jerusalem and the West Bank, we'd been used to the response from Israel, right? More gunpowder, shooting to kill with live ammunition, and more arrests, the usual menu. Gaza, however, in there, Israel launched a full war, an attack more violent and determined than the previous two that Gaza had suffered in the past few years. In 50 days of war, 2,139 Palestinian civilians were killed. 11,000 were wounded. 50 days. Almost 500 children, 490 to be exact, were killed. 3,000 were wounded. I cannot even begin to describe to you what I saw in the eyes of those children as I treated them as a doctor. What horrors they had seen, what haunts them as they look at you with their innocent eyes. They've been traumatized, and I doubt that they will ever recover. In the time it took for the world to prevail upon Israel to be satisfied by the amount of Palestinian blood it had shed. About 500,000 people were displaced, 20,000 homes were destroyed, were schools, hospitals, even United Nations buildings. Nothing and no one was spared. Nothing was off limits. Gaza became a heap of rubble, and under its ashes, the pretense of a peace process was buried once and for all. Israeli settler attacks were becoming more frequent and more violent and, of course, unaccountable in the form of the so-called price tag attacks to exact the price from Palestinians, either private property, churches, or mosques, or even from Israeli police themselves, for any action taken against the settlement enterprise. The worst of these was in July of 2015 in the village of Douma near Nablus. The family house was burned at dawn, with the Dawabshe family sleeping inside. An 18-month-old baby died that day. The mother died a week later, the father a month later almost. The only survivor was Ahmad, the 4-year-old then, who had suffered extensive burns and is still being treated till this day. And the Israeli official response came by Minister of Defense Moshe Ya'alon was that they had suspects, but that the suspects were not being identified or apprehended to protect the sources. So never mind justice and accountability and law, protecting sources was more important. And this is what shows you how inconsequential Palestinian lives are to Israel. By the end of September, and in the midst of the increasing violation to the Al-Aqsa Mosque by the Jewish extremist groups, a sense of completely being deserted by everyone, no hope for a better future, no political solution in sight, day by day losing more ground, feeling the noose of the separation wall closing tighter and tighter, while swallowing more of what was supposed to be the Palestinian state, along with the ever-expanding illegal settlements, we started witnessing a new phase in which we find ourselves today. For young Palestinian teenage boys, if no one else was going to protect what was left for them, they would have to do it themselves, knowing well that they will most probably be shot dead extrajudicially. But that was a risk they were willing to take. They had lost everything, lost faith in the older leadership, in peace negotiations, seeing more Palestinian rights being violated while being asked to give more and more concessions. Sadly, in their young minds, there was no other solution but violence. So today, as Israel continues to disregard international law and violate it, and the intention for a solution remains elusive. Prime Minister Netanyahu clearly said 2 weeks ago that he refuses the 1967 borders, right, which is the second from last there, stipulated by the United Nations resolutions, and the return of the Palestinian refugees, all of which are elements of the proposed initiatives based on UN resolutions, including the Arab Initiative and the recent French call for a peace conference. The only thing he did agree to was that Arab countries recognize Israel. So the current Israeli government is the most extreme right-wing government since the creation of Israel, and that's by Israeli account, right, the opposition. It's giving free rein to extremists, fully armed settlers to roam around the West Bank, live under a separate law system than the occupied Palestinians, use a separate road system, separate transportation, living their own democracy while at the same time occupying the land, abusing the resources of the Palestinians. So this is what would be left, and this is not water, the blue that you see, this is occupation. What would be left to have a state for Palestine would be those little bits of white around, if anyone can have a state like that. So what hope is there, and what can the churches and church-related organizations do? Please, focus on the human beings. Regardless of what the political situation will be, if there will ever be one, whether in the form of a two-state, which is no longer possible theoretically or physically on the ground, or a one-state with equal rights to all, which would be more of a dream, of course one that would be absolutely unwelcome to Israel. No matter what, we need to support the steadfastness of the people by helping to build the capacities of the society, supporting schools, libraries, education, and churches, not just providing services. It pains us to see, for example, Asian, South American, African, Russian, European, and American church groups coming to visit the sites, like being on a safari. Church pilgrimage must be responsible. In planning ahead, you can coordinate with Palestinian tour groups. And tour guides. Prepare your groups with reading ahead with abundantly available material on the WCC website. And once there, if you don't do anything before, meet the people, talk to the people, spend time with the people. Because without these people remaining there, there soon will not be even the stones to visit. And once you are back, please speak of your witness. The Kairos Palestine document also states that any use of the Bible that provides a theological cover-up for illegal Israeli occupation, including many forms of Christian Zionism, is far from Christian teaching. We have to be careful and pay attention to where we hear that and see that. Nonviolent resistance must be the way to diminish and do away with violence. The WCC has had economic measure policies for many years now concerning Palestine and Israel. But when one church is under attack for taking a position of solidarity with Palestinians, show support for your brothers and sisters, even if you are unable yourself as a church to take that stand. And lastly, as we're reminded of the crisis of Syria and the Syrian refugees, let us not forget that the 700,000 Palestinians that were displaced and became refugees by the creation of the State of Israel, with the consent and the help of the international community, are now over 7 million Palestinians around the world waiting to come home. Thank you.
And now for our third contribution, going to the farthest south of the three territories, to Egypt. Mr. Hany Fawzi, who is director of Step to Future, a civil society activist in Egypt and a blogger in media. And then I know bloggers always have to be pretty short, but you're allowed the same time as everyone else. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for all of you, and good morning. Okay, my presentation is with a different background. As you can see, it's abstract of what I will say. And my presentation with the title of Millennials, a New Pilgrimage Model. For those of you who are not acquainted with the term of millennials, I will come to that, but first I will, with you, read these quotes from, and I will tell you more. We live in a time of endings and beginnings, death and rebirth. What is ending and dying is an old economic logic, an old way of building societal institutions and organizing work and life. And what is beginning and wanting to be born is a new awareness, an economic logic of collaboration, a new quality of relating to another and to ourselves. What we are witnessing in our age is death of one civilization and born of another.
and the birth of another. And we, in our institutions, economies, networks, communities, and personal situations, we know both sides of this transformation journey firsthand. We experience and live through that death and rebirth every single day. That was an exhibit not for circulation in 2012 under the name of Society 4.0, like a version of software. From ecosystem economies to ecosystem economies. In 2014, it was published with the new name, Leading from the Emerging Future. The authors are professors in MIT, and MIT published the book at 2014. In this book, in the introduction of the book, the authors mentioned 25th of January 2011, the date of the Egyptian Revolution, as one of the turning points in the future being born. They talk a lot about what happened in the Arab Spring and how this is a real milestone of what's going on and what will happen later. At the time, Tahrir Square was turned into a symbol. And I'm using here Tahrir Squares because just after the revolution in 2011, the movements spread all over the world, and young guys in New York used, and while they are occupying Wall Street, they called the place where they are sitting in Tahrir Square. And that happened again in Madrid and then expanded everywhere. Tahrir Squares, Tahrir means liberation. For those who don't know the Arabic word, Tahrir is an Arabic word, means liberation. And liberation was the dream that forced a lot of people to go out and just say, freedom for all. On 15th of October 2011, a global protest was planned and started in like 950 cities in like 82 countries. Hundreds of thousands of young people moved around and went to streets, and they defending the same universal values in such 82 countries. They were all of them defending freedom, dignity, and justice. That was part of a series of movements, global movements, that was inspired by the Arab Spring. These demonstrations were launched under the slogan "United for Global Change," and the hashtag. Sorry, what's that? Something like that. Yeah. And this is the hashtag. Hashtag is a way in social media to follow up subjects. So when you put this hashtag sign, everybody using the same hashtag things appear in the same page for those who are not so acquainted with the social media. Reasons for such movements were varied, yet it mainly targeted the growing economic inequality, corporate influence over governments and international institutions, and the lack of truly democratic institutions allowing direct public participation at all levels, local and global. And let me tell you the bad news, that all these frustrations are still there, and it's getting more. So, millennials, the great next generation. Millennials, these movements didn't have superheroes, it had ordinary heroes. Those ordinary heroes are the millennials. Millennials are a term used to describe the generation born between 1982, 1981, up to 2000 or 2004. So almost those who are now like from 14, 15 years, teenagers, till those who are reaching their mid-30s. the term was coined by William Strauss and Neil Ho in the mid-80s. And they made a book, published a book in 2000 titled Millennials Rising, the Next Great Generation, and they are. So let me tell you some more words about the millennials. Millennials are described as digital citizens. They are the first generation in history that is always connected, always connected. They all the time steeped in digital technology and social media, and they treat their multitasking handheld gadgets almost like a body part. Their phone is part of their body. Google is part of their memories. So you cannot ask them to leave their part of their bodies outside the hall. They should be here. It's part of them. So they are all the time discourse texts, phone calls, emails, songs, news, videos, games, a very intensive communication all the time, multidimensional, sending messages all the time, receiving multidimensional messages all the time. And though you might see them alone, but they are alone together. And together, yes, they are. And alone together, they formed networks of outrage and hope. These networks extended from Iceland to Tunisia, from Cairo to New York, from Sudan to Toronto, from everywhere. They are everywhere. They are connected everywhere. And they are defending the same universal values. And they are talking the same language. After the revolution in 2011, I've met with fellows from Occupy London and Occupy Wall Street. And we were all saying the same things. We are all defending the same values. We are all struggling against the same oppression and the same inequalities. They are self-expressive through their social media. They are on track to become the most educated generation with the biggest number of postgraduate degrees. They are much more educated than previous generations. They have developed different social trends. For example, they're less likely to marry. It's not a surprise if you can just notice what's going around you. In Egypt, the latest official numbers in Egypt announces a reduction in population growth rate, first time in 10 years. Less marriages in cities, higher divorce rate in the age group of 30 to 35. There is something being changed. They are about to be the largest workforce in Egypt. They are changing the workplace mood and relations. While I was on my flight, I watched the movie of Robert De Niro, the movie called Experience Never Gets Old. That was in a workplace, different workplace, open space. The CEO is riding a bicycle inside the office. There's things being changed. Though I'm not so sure. Yeah, what to do. Anyways. They are changing the workplace mood. They are developing different consumption habits, and they are consuming with a reciprocity principle, while consuming the fast-moving consumer goods or while consuming the religious discourse. So if they are not feeling head-to-head with whoever providing them products or services, they are not very satisfied customers. And they have different approach to religion. A recent published study, American study, talks about 3 million atheists in Egypt among the Egyptian youth. 3 million, which is something. They are less religious, a trend that becomes clearer as they are getting older. The two reactions of fanaticism and dropping religion off seems to me like two faces of the same coin, and a probable reaction to an old, dated religious discourse, either Christian or Islamic. that trap them in a paradoxical position, either to be religious in a way that fits Middle Ages or just to be themselves. On the other hand, the segments of millennials are changing, developing new model of being religious in a way that they have issues with organized religion because of both social and intellectual reasons. They choose practicing more humanitarian values than practicing religion, fasting and going to ceremonies and stuff. The new model of spirituality they are developing could be easily noticed in their statuses on Facebook, their tweets, and their Instagram photos. They choose personal spirituality over formal organized religion. And the question is, does this mean that the number of youth who are religious according to the old institutional manuals is small? And my answer is no. Still, the number is big. But the numbers, the absolute numbers are very deceiving. The issue is the percentage. I think the percentage is getting less and less every time. And it will be getting less, except the religious institutions start to adopt a discourse that is biased to the people, biased to the justice and not to the governments, a discourse that respects science, a discourse that only defends justice and freedom. Otherwise, the customers will be no more there. Let me tell you that 46% of the Egyptian population, like 40 million people, are millennials. So those who are searching for authoritarian models will have a really tough time. With their new mindset, digital values, eagerness to defend universal values, and desire to play for fun, their new tools, the changes are big in every aspect of life. Their revolution, and this is important, and this comes with what Dr. Mitri have mentioned, their revolution is a process. It's not an event. It's not just an event happened in 2011 and finished. No, the process is going everywhere, and it every day gets a new point of power. Just today in the morning, I see something on foreign policy that there is a silent social revolution that happens in Egypt, and they are talking about that religious part in terms of very small victories for an oppressed women, like getting off hijab for those who are forced to do so. So while the revolution and their revolution seems beaten, it's not. It's not. They cannot get the parliamentary majority, but they can stop those who are in power to do whatever they want. Authoritarian regimes, military or religious, and authoritarian institutions both have no place in the future. And this is very clear for me, and I think very clear for this young generation. We deserve better options. We work to generate alternatives, and we will do it. And that was a status of a young guy on the Facebook. We start better alternatives than execution with the electric chair or bullets by the religious systems or military systems. Being authoritarian or supporting authoritarian entities is an option of unaffordable cost in the near future. The old discourse and the old mindset are obsolete. The old experience is irrelevant. Power is decaying. It has become easier to get, harder to use, and easier to lose. So for being in charge, it wasn't the same like before. This is a quote from Moises Naim. Moises Naim is the former editor-in-chief of foreign policy, and he published a book 2 years ago with the name End of Power. Power is ending. It is not the same. The idea, the concept of power is decaying. A new world is not good or bad. It's new, different than what we used to do. Those who will not be able to cope with the new changes will just go like a natural evolution. I will not say more. Finally, this is my last slide. A new pilgrimage model pathway of social justice, freedom, and dignity is being built. A way paved by those amazing people. and their sacrifices, by the high prices they are paying. The pathway is enriched by technology, full of fun, and painted with their tattoos, and heading to a world of more justice and peace. If you don't know millennials, just go and interact with those very amazing people among you, wearing colorful shirts. They are very nice people, and they're very educated, and they're really, for me, renewed the hope that we might have a better world in the future, in the near future, I wish. They are changing how life is being understood and approached. Please, just follow them, not engage them. Follow them. They are the only hope. Thank you.
Thank you. We are all tempted when we plan a plenary to squeeze in very much, and when we speak also there is so much to be said. Sometimes this is, of course, at the cost of the possibilities of entering into the discussion for the people, for the plenary, and I'm afraid that's exactly where we are now. But we have gotten so important and interesting perspectives, different from each other, but still pertaining to reality, to the present reality, in many parts of the world. And we are most grateful for what you have given to us from Syria, Palestine and Israel, and Egypt, but also, as I said, it is an international connection in all of this. Therefore, I am forced to now move to directly to the listeners' part. I think it is important here now that those three who have been asked, not in a formal manner at all, I don't even know whom they are, but they were thought to give some different reactions to what we have experienced. And I don't know in what order you will start. So is it Robert Smith who is first, or no? Yeah. Well, sometimes it's good with silence and meditation, so.
Yes.
Please.
So my name is Robert Smith, and I'm with Mona Mushahwar, the co-moderator of the Palestine Israel Ecumenical Forum. We, as the three listeners, we were actually sharing ideas back and forth, and so in a sense I'll be the one who's been building with a small consensus in our group to share what we've been saying. So we have some key points and some proposed actions, knowing that none of what we say is is definitive or binding for this Central Committee, but some thoughts.
Not at all. That's important to know. These are reactions.
So, key points. What is happening in the Middle East is relevant to global movements and transitions. These dynamics are not just over there, but are already on your streets. As Hany said, global networks of outrage and hope are present in your communities as well. We're still early in the Middle East regional transitions and political processes. Nothing is over. We need a longer historical timeline. Therefore, the WCC needs a horizon of accompaniment in the midst of these challenges, a commitment to walk alongside Middle Eastern Christian sisters and brothers and all peoples in the region for a long time. Claims on victimhood can help perpetuate the problem while not offering meaningful contributions toward conflict transformation. The people of the region are suffering, especially in Iraq and Syria. But we need to think not just in macro levels, but remember that communities and people have been made vulnerable, that people are suffering day to day, and those realities can be lost behind numbers. The particular suffering of children and youth should be emphasized but also the leadership of young people who have lost faith in previous political structures. Focusing on the lives and well-being of children helps provide a lens to view regional conflicts. And finally, religion is a vital force in the Middle East, but new models of religious engagement are developing, especially among young adults, the majority of people in the region. This is a demographic reality that cannot be ignored. And then moving to proposed actions. Strong support for developing indigenous Arab Christian political theologies to promote Christian engagement and activity in shaping their futures, perhaps echoing the Kairos process of South Africa. A profound need for interreligious, especially Muslim Christian engagement, new forms of conversation needed in the context of political struggle. These are new forms of interreligious engagement and dialogue that are needed to meet the challenges of the present time. A call for the end of sieges, collective punishments, and the practices of holding political prisoners, problems that are experienced throughout the region and that must be challenged by the churches. A focus on the lives of human beings, on the flourishing of human communities, rather than any particular ideology or aspirational political structure. Speak, for instance, not of the political entities of Israel and Palestine, or the geographic area of Israel/Palestine, but the lives and well-being of Israelis and Palestinians and Egyptians and Syrians and Lebanese. Strengthen efforts to connect church leadership and young adult leaders, both within and outside the churches, both to promote young adults and preserve church possibilities. So these are the points raised by the listeners, Alicia, Frank, and Robert.
And we thank you for that. I once again underline that this, of course, is not in any way a decision-making thing. These were reactions from listeners that we might individually carry with us and see what we do with them. I would like to thank those of you who have now contributed, Your Eminency, and the three panelists up here. You have given us some of the things we expected, and much more. This puts this important area of life into the center of our conscience, and also we realize how, as I said in the beginning, interconnected we are. Thank you very much. This session was supposed to end at 5 to 11, because now I hand over to the General Secretary for announcements, and he doesn't want to give any announcements. Okay, he needs coffee first, which means that I will close this session. We give them an applause, and then we reconvene here.